Isaiah chapter 22. And in this section that starts back in verse 15, it is a prophecy against Shebna and his pride.
What you're looking at is the original meter base on the house. This is from 1957.
I'm not the only one who's having some problems with the technology. But Shebna, in case y'all are wondering, it was a video or something, or a recording. Or Shebna was someone who was proud, but God was going to bring him down. We have seen in this his slow from an elevated position being brought down in steps, and God's going to eventually remove him totally. And the one who's going to take his place is Eliakim. And he would be clothed with Shebna's robe and would be given the keys. And last week we talked a lot about the keys, the power or authority, and how that does have an application in relationship to Christ, as he is the one who has all authority, all power, Matthew 28, verse 19 or 18. And he gave that authority to bind and to loose what God had already bound and loosed, to first the Peter, Matthew 16, verse 19, then all of the apostles in John the 20th chapter in verse 22, and then what I believe to be the church itself in Matthew 18 and verse 18. Eliakim's going to be a peg that in a wall, in other words, someone who has some strength and stability among or in himself. But we start seeing a little bit of problems here in verse 24, that the offspring, vessels of small quantity, vessels of cups, and even all the vessels of flagons, these are going to be people who are, for lack of a better term, hanger owners. They hang on to him. They try and ride his coattails to get his power and have the authority as well. And they don't have that position that he had, so it becomes a problem. Verse 25 then, in that day, saith the Lord of hosts, shall the nail that is fastened in the sure place be removed, and be cut down and fall, and the burden that was upon it shall be cut off, for the Lord hath spoken it. This verse has been called an enigma. There's a short in this wire. That's what it is. And so I'm gonna have to try and do something that I can't do, and that's stay still. This verse has been called an enigma. And I really don't see the problems that some see with it. There's some individuals who have this referring back to Shebna. Most individuals have it referring to Eliakim. Others, in seeing the typology that has been presented, and Eliakim that is, see this as a reference to the Messiah, or Christ, and his death on the cross. It seems out of place for it to refer to Shebna. Shebna was never that peg or that nail that was fastened in a secure place. So I don't see how it could refer to him. Those who take that I think just have to ignore the context and ignore what's been said. It must refer to Eliakim. The question is the typology in relationship to the Messiah. To me, it seems inconsistent to accept this as being or having reference to the Messiah, to Christ, because of the aspect he is going to be cut down and fall. Even though Jesus was put to death on the cross, I don't believe and I don't see how anyone could say that is being cut down and fall. It would be inconsistent with the nature of what the death of Christ is all about. In fact, through his death, we have salvation. Jesus in Matthew 16 and 18, that upon this rock, and that rock, of course, as we know, is Peter's confession that thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God, that by that death, Jesus says, I'm going to build the church. The gates of Hades, the Hadean realm, would not prevail, in the sense of it would not prevent his establishing of the church. How could that be being cut down and falling? So I don't see that it has any reference to the Messiah. Well, what about the previous? Let me change. So what about the typology of the previous verses?
Well, in verse 23, he says he's going to take a knife and drive a nail in there for him. That nail he's going to pull out now.
Well, yes. It's from the standpoint of, and that's why I say I believe it refers only to Eliakim. Eliakim's going to be that sure peg. But now then he's going to be cut down and fall. I'll get to that in a second. A little bit more. You might say that, yes. When you're dealing with typology, even as with parables, you cannot extend the parable or the typology beyond the intended aspect to take more than what is really being taught. It's a very basic principle. I'll use a misapplication of it to show the application. Because people understand this principle. They go, and when you're talking about the rich man and Lazarus, and invariably those who want to deny the reality of an eternal torment and teach that hell is simply going out of existence, they will say, well, that's just a parable. And I'm not trying to get into a discussion whether it's a parable or not at this time. I'll just say it's not. But the reason they then will say, well, what about it still teaches what it teaches, right? Well, no, a parable only deals with one aspect as to its application. And to apply, you don't take everything that's in the parable and apply it in the way in which we normally would. They understand that principle, and so they say it's a parable, and thus what it teaches about the rich man being in torments, that's just an elaboration of the parable. It's really not dealing with him being in torments, but it's trying to teach the nature that we should have of trying to teach others. And thus it's limited to that. They're wrong all around except in the principle that they're using. Don't take a parable or, in this sense, typology and extend it beyond the intended purpose of it. So when we come down to verse 25, while it has reference to Eliakim, do we also have to say that is part of the typology of the previous verses? And the answer is no, we don't. Moses obviously was a type of the Messiah. And I have a book in my library written by Brother James D. Bales titled Like Unto Moses, I think is the name of it, or A Prophet Like Unto Moses. Talking about Christ and the parallel or the typology of Moses and Christ. Did Moses commit sin? Well, obviously he did. Thus, did Christ commit sin? No. You don't take the typology and apply it to things that the Bible doesn't make application to. Okay, same with Eliakim. Eliakim will be given the keys. And he will have that authority of the keys, that power that the keys represent. But in verse 24, he's dealing now with, here's these people who like him while he's a sure or steady peg that's built into the wall and also serves as support for the wall. What happens if you put a peg into a wall and then start hanging things upon it and get heavier and heavier and heavier? Eventually, it's going to do what? It's going to pull out and break the wall apart. That's what's happening in verse 24. Here's these people who are trying to hang on to him, all of his relatives, because he's that sure peg. He has that authority and that power. So what do? They try and hang on to him. And now then, verse 25, even though that nail is fastened in a sure place, what's going to happen? Because of verse 24 and all of these relatives that are hanging on to him, going to be removed and cut down and fall. And the burden that was upon it shall be cut off. The burden Well, what does that have reference to? The previous verse and those people who are trying to hang on to him and get that same power that he had. We call that today nepotism. That's what you have here. A problem of nepotism of Eliakim and those of his family, and the weight that they bear upon him, pulling him down. And so the same fate that happened to Shebna happens to Eliakim. Then he ends it with, the Lord hath spoken it. In other words, this prophecy is sure. There's no question about it. It's truthfulness, what's going to happen, because the Lord of hosts has spoken it. The Lord of armies has spoken it. Questions, comments, or anything before we go into chapter 23?
The previous context earlier in the chapter, like somewhere like 18 through 21, aren't there details in there somewhere in that little mid-paragraph that's referring to the Messiah at some point?
Well, we said yes. The power and the keys that were given to Eliakim has reference to the Messiah, or not reference to him. It is a typology of him. It's not a reference to the Messiah, it's typology. It was given to Eliakim, but he becomes a type of Christ in having that power or authority, or the keys. Chapter 23 then. In the first 7 verses, we have the announcement of doom, and this is dealing with the city of Tyre. And Andrew, if you would change that over real quick. If you look at the top where it says, maybe you can read Phoenicia, you have Tyre and Sidon in that area. Maybe a little bit more as far as the entire area. This one also shows where Jerusalem is, and thus Tyre and Sidon's relationship as far as where it would be in relationship to Jerusalem. And then, well, when you know. Andrew, advance that one more, please. That one a little bit closer. Same one as the last one, except this one's blown up a little bit more. But hopefully you can see Tyre and Sidon there. You can also see where Ashdod is toward the bottom, and Joppa. Hopefully you remember that one in Acts the 8th chapter. You also see Damascus. Damascus is pretty close, or pretty much just east of Sidon. So that gives you a view as to where these cities are that are going to be destroyed. Now then, Andrew, if you can go back to the other one. And we have in verse 1, the burden of Tyre, howl, ye ships of Tarshish, for it is laid waste, so that there is no house, no entering in. From the land of Chittim it is revealed to them. Tyre, as you could see in the, or hopefully could see in what we just showed, is one of the two main cities of the Phoenicians. And that's why I pointed out Phoenicia, while you have the Philistine area south of it. This is Phoenicia. So Tyre and Sidon, they oftentimes go together because those are the two main cities. Tyre itself was made up of two cities, though. It's a very interesting situation. One of the cities was on the mainland, while the other one was just off of the mainland, and it became it was it was a fortress city that was just off the coast. The Babylonians attacked Tyre, and Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to it for 13 years, 585 to 572. He conquered the main city. The main city was there on the mainland. He conquered that. But what they would do is that they would leave that and go over to the island city. In the 13 years that Nebuchadnezzar tried, he never conquered that island city. I was just going to bring that up. In 332, Alexander the Great took the island city. What he did, and the way in which he accomplished it, he had taken the main city on the mainland. He basically took everything from that and they made a causeway out to the island city. And so he used the rubbish of the main city to get to the other fortress city. And thus, he was able to conquer that city. Others, I don't know of anyone else who did. But after Alexander got through with it, it never really recovered from that destruction.
Romans did something similar to that when they took Messiah. They had to build a causeway all the way up to the wall because it was building there. They had to get across it.
With Masada and the Romans, they had to build a walkway or causeway up to the city in order to take it. And if you haven't read much about Masada, it's interesting, but yet in many respects, a sickening reading because of what all they went through, put it that way. Tyre and Sidon were major commercial cities of the ancient world. If you remember the map, you could see they were right on the coast and situated in a perfect location to go out into the Mediterranean. Rolf Ruffner pointed out that these seagoing traveling salesmen piled their ships all along the Mediterranean, out into the Atlantic, and even southward to the Indian Ocean, where their ships found a protected cove or wherever their ships found a protective code, they planted a commercial colony.
When you say protective, C-O-V-E, code,
Protected.
protective, C-O-V-E, what was that?
Cove, yes.
Oh, okay.
C-O-V-E. A protected area in which they could escape any of the storms or anything like into that, and they planted a commercial colony there. So the ships returning to Tarsus, or from Tarsus, which was a Phoenician colony in Spain. So this is how far out that their commercial interest resided, all the way to Spain. Phoenician colony. They were told to howl or wail because of the destruction of Tyre. There's no houses left, no possibility of entering the harbor, thus no entering in. Chittim would be Cyprus, and the ships from Tarsus would probably have to stop at Chittim on the way there, on the way to Tyre. And as they stopped there, they would learn of the destruction of Tyre. So the word would spread, and thus you can't go to Tyre. It's destroyed. There's no place to go get in. So forget about it.
They didn't have cell phones and radios like we do now. So
They didn't? Are you sure?
I don't know. They come to the sun, who's sure about anything?
I think it would be a pretty safe bet that they didn't have cell phones or anything like that. I would say something that would get me in trouble, but I'll refrain. In verse 2 then, "Be still, ye inhabitants of the isle, thou whom the merchants of Zidon that pass over the sea have replenished." Be still. That's an interesting idea. It's not just like I was trying to do a while ago, and one's successful and won't be successful, and just remaining, without moving. That's not what he's really talking about. It's the idea of being silent in the sense of don't complain, don't lament, don't sorrow for them. They're still, they're silent in the sense that, it could be in the sense that they are struck speechless by such awe and horror. Have you ever seen something and you can't speak? Your emotions and the terror, the horror of it, it's just so bad that you just can't say anything.
Like the people hanging their mouth open when they were watching the World Trade Center fall and that.
Okay, a lot of people were like that during the 9/11 in the World Trade Center and the events that happened there. They were just struck. When the Hindenburg burned and all of that. I guess the one announcer who became famous for it, just a lot of the times he couldn't say anything because he was just struck by awe and horror at it. That's kind of what he's saying here. Be still. There's a horror, there's a terror that is there that is so bad, just don't do anything. Remain silent. Be still.
Like volcano erupted in 70-something AD, and just like speechless, just thinking of all the implications of what's going on with those people next to it, you know. So apparent ain't nothing to talk about as much.
You're talking about Vesuvius when that erupted? You could probably say that about most volcanic eruptions, especially when they're near a populated area. But here, be still ye inhabitants of the isle. It could be the new city that had been built just off of the mainland, and thus part of Tyre. But it seems to be the entire Phoenician strip. He's using a part for the entirety. The inhabitants of the isle being that entire area of Phoenicia. And if you recall from the map, Phoenicia is not very wide. It was a narrow strip, but it was all along the coast. So, thou whom the merchants of Zidon. Zidon is Sidon. So you have the two main cities now being included, Tyre, now then Sidon. Sidon was, though, secondary to Tyre. Its merchants were enriched Tyre, but they were no longer to go there. We're getting our riches from over here, but don't go there anymore. What happens with a lot of people today? You get your riches from, you're told, don't go there. You go anyway, don't you? That's what we see because of the greed of people. They're being told, don't go there. It's been destroyed. There's no reason to go. You're not going to get rich by going there now. You're not going to have your wealth there. And so in verse 3, and by the great waters, the seed of Sihor, the harvest of the river, is her revenue, and she is a mart of nations. The great waters, that has reference to the Mediterranean Sea. Sometimes it was referred to as the Great Sea. So the great waters, well, it's Mediterranean. The seed, or the crop of Sihor, and Sihor literally is dark colored, and probably applied here to the Egyptians because of their darker skin. The harvest of the river would be the crops of the Nile. So you have the crops of the Nile. Here's the Egyptians. It would be taken to the mouth of the Nile and then placed on Phoenician ships and brought to Tyre.
But Sihor would be a little bit away from the delta, wouldn't it? It wouldn't be west up against Egypt, would it? It'd be like north of it, or am I wrong?
Sidon?
Yeah, Sihor.
Oh.
Like, not west up against Egypt, the delta, but like a little bit above it. I'm just wondering. I forgot. I'm wondering, my memory is keen.
I'm not sure exactly where Sihor is, but it was here. It's not applying specifically to that sea. It's dealing with the grain that they received in that area. So it would be taken to the mouth of the Nile, placed on Phoenician ships, and then brought to Tyre, which of course produced the revenue for the Egyptians. And thus Tyre is referred to as the mart of nations. Mart being the trader or the marketplace of nations. See, you didn't realize how old Walmart was, did you? See? That's kind of like the oldest cars, I guess, are Hondas, because they were all in one accord. There are a whole bunch of those. But yes, this would be the Walmart of nations in that sense. It was a marketplace. They received the grain, gave the money to the, can I say farmers? In this case, the Egyptians. And then they would then trade with others and thus make their money. But the problem now is, what's happened to Tyre? It's destroyed. Where are they going to ply their trade now? You know, where are they going to make the sales and all of this? Well, they're going to have to go elsewhere. They can't go to Tyre because there's no trading anymore there. In verse 4, then, be thou ashamed, O Zidon, for the sea hath spoken, even the strength of the sea, saying, I travail not, nor bring forth children, neither do I nourish up young men, nor bring up virgins. Zidon, or Sidon, is the mother city of the city of Phoenicia. Again, about 25 miles really north of Tyre. But again, it's probably being used to refer to all of Phoenicia. They are to be ashamed because of Tyre and her desolation. It was so desolate that it was no longer able to leave any children. In other words, he's saying, you're not going to have anything to show for your existence.
In Ezekiel 27, first part of the chapter, the Lord says about Tyre, like the top of a rock, a bare rock or something like that.
Okay, that's basically what it's going to happen. They're going to be a bare rock where people would spread their nets to go out, as they would go out and come back in with the nets of fishing. They would spread their nets there. So, nothing to show for its existence in reality. The strength that it's talking about here, the strength of the sea, is probably that island fortress that was just off of the coast. Their present wealth and power that they had was but illusionary. Wanted to mention just kind of an application, a couple of things. Be thou ashamed. We live in a world today that has no shame, seems like. The immorality, the ungodliness, the immodesty, the fornication, the adultery, the drunkenness, and you can go on with all of the sins that we see so prevalent in our nation today. and no one seems to have any shame whatsoever. It truly is that our nation is kind of like what Jeremiah described. They were not able to blush. That's pretty much the way our nation is.
Like they don't give a hoot either.
No, that's true. They don't care one way or the other. These people were to be ashamed. Now then, the application that is made here is they were to be ashamed because of the desolation of Tyre. It was totally destroyed. Why was it totally destroyed? Because of sin, because of their wickedness. And thus others were to be ashamed because of that. You think our nation would be ashamed if a nation that was wicked and sinful was destroyed today? They wouldn't care, because it would be, in some sense, it would be hard to find a nation that's as wicked. Now, I'm talking about generalities. Of course, I truly believe that what we see today advertised so much as a smaller group that is certainly not the majority of Americans. But I think we have become conditioned to accept those things. And that conditioning is growing more and more all the time. It's good that, for example, Sidon would at least be able to feel shame for the desolation of Tyre. Then I wanted also to mention, we'll just barely mention this, their wealth and power were illusionary. Our nation becomes rich, powerful, has all of the military, has all of these things, technology galore. What's the only thing that matters, though? Fear God and keep His commandments, as Solomon puts it. Everything else is illusionary. Jesus, the question, what does man gain, or what does man profited if he gained the whole world and lose his own soul? All of those things are illusionary. The power that one might have, the strength, the prestige, the money, or wealth, all of those things are illusionary. They're not real. And yet, our nation, that's the main thing that we seek after, we go after. And we need to be brought back to the reality of what God's will is and doing God's will. And the principle that righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. We'll stop there and begin with verse 5 then, Lord willing, next week.